Turn it over to the good senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and to Ms. Blackburn for this important hearing. And it's great to be able to listen to Chair Cantwell as well. To all the members of the panel, thank you so much for being here today and offering your expertise. One area I've spent a considerable amount of time during my time in the Senate on this issue surrounding broadband, I'll say, as opposed to AI, is in the area of transparency and making things easier to understand. And what I mean by that is Senator Cassidy and I, we introduced something called the TLDR, which was too long, didn't read act. And we all know what those agreements look like, pages and pages of documents. And before you can download or use something, you go down a little box and it says accept terms of agreement, and people click that and they move on and they don't realize what's there. I was also proud to see and advocate during the bipartisan infrastructure bill something called nutrition labeling for broadband to make it easier for consumers to compare services across the way. Now, the same type of transparency and easy to understand documentation is also needed so that consumers know where they are interacting with AI, know how their information is going to be used, and know when content is generated by AI. And I'm working on legislation to require this type of transparency and disclosures and responsibilities. Now, Mr. Gregory, you mentioned that threats from synthetic media and disinformation most impact those already at risk, like minority groups that face other forms of threats and discrimination. Mr. Gregory, yes or no, are deep fakes and AI-generated disinformation already being created in Spanish and other non-English languages?
Yes.
And Mr. Gregory, yes or no, do you believe technology companies invest enough resources into making sure AI systems work equally well in non-English languages?
Systems are not as adequate in non-English languages, and there are less resources invested in making them applicable in non-English languages. And when it comes to deepfakes, many tools work less effectively for detection in less dominant languages outside of English.
And with that being said, Mr. Gregory, would the current system make more communities even more vulnerable in the U.S. and globally to the risk of synthetic media?
This is exactly the concern that my organization has spent the last 5 years working on, is the vulnerability of communities in the U.S. and globally to synthetic media because of their exclusion from access to tools and support around it.
Well, thank you for your work in that space and bringing attention to it. I introduced a piece of legislation called the Listos Act this year to address the lack of non-English investment in multilingual large language models. Any action Congress takes on AI transparency must protect our most marginalized communities, including non-English speakers. And for those that don't know what Listos means, it means ready, but it's an acronym. So I credit the staff for coming up with an acronym that calls to action to ensure that we'd all get ready. Now, AI systems are useful in a huge variety of scenarios, from making financial decisions to medical diagnosis and content modernization. And I believe government should also utilize AI for improving constituents' access to government services. This just goes to show the broad application of what AI can do. Now, Ms. Espinal, AI systems are used in different sectors and for different purposes. And these various systems can have different kinds of outputs. For example, we have predictive AI making best guesses and generative AI creating content. I have a hard time keeping up with a lot of this stuff, but maybe the Insight Forum tomorrow will help a little for folks like myself. But understandably, consumers and other users of these systems will have very different experiences interacting in these systems. Now, my question to you stems from, if people even know they are interacting with an AI system, which is not a given, so under that premise, isn't it then necessary that any transparency and oversight requirements be specific to the sector or use case of the AI system?
So you are absolutely correct that AI is used in many different ways and has many different outputs and has many different consequences. So I would say a couple of things. One is, I think, in terms of having transparency so that, for example, a consumer knows if they're interacting with an AI service like a chatbot. I think that's important. But I would also say, to build on that, is that looking at the specific uses, perhaps as opposed to looking at a sector, but looking to see whether or not that use is going to have a consequential decision on someone's life. Is it going to impact their ability to access government services, to access public benefits, to get a loan, to get education, to get a job? And if it is, if it's going to have a consequential decision on someone's life, then we believe at BSA that companies should be required by legislation to do impact assessments to identify those risks and then take steps to reduce those risks.
I appreciate that very much. Now, Professor, under the thought of the explosion of generative AI, which we know has serious implications for the integrity of our information ecosystems, do you agree that Congress should require tech companies to label any AI-generated content with disclosures and metadata that includes information on how the content was created?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, they should. And I want to also thank you for your first remark about TLDR and the privacy nutrition labels. This is something that's absolutely essential in this space. Create something that's easy for people to understand. And as I understand it, Apple has introduced 2 years ago these labels that are privacy schematics that are easy to understand for people. And those need to be adapted for the purposes of what it is you were introducing in your opening remarks.
I appreciate that very much, Professor. Now, Mr. Chairman, I have several other questions, but I see my time has expired. I've already exceeded it. I'll submit them into the record. But I just want to thank you all for what you have been doing, what you're going to continue to do, those that are participating in one form or another with a forum tomorrow, and especially for the follow-up coming out of this as well. And so for those of you I did not speak to very much or at all, I have some questions for you as well, and I'll get them to you. So I look forward to hearing back from you and your expertise on the subject. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.